So here in Cinema 4D, my render has finished. This whole sequence is rendered out, so I'm going to jump into After Effects and composite this together. So in After Effects, I'm just going to right-click in my project window, go to Import File, and I'm going to grab the first frame of my sequence, and After Effects should detect that it's a sequence. It'll see there's sequentially numbered files, so we just need to make sure the sequence is turned on, and then open, and that will bring this in, and it'll treat it like a movie file. Now, one thing to be careful of is After Effects is defaulting to 30 frames a second, and I use 25 frames a second for all of my animation work. I can tell here because if I click on my sequence in the project bin, it's telling me it's 1920 by 1080 and it is 30 frames a second. So we need to tell After Effects how to interpret this footage so that it's actually the right frame rate. So I'm going to right-click the footage, go to Interpret Footage, go to the main settings, and I'm just going to change its frame rate to 25 frames a second. Okay, so I can drag and drop this sequence onto a new composition button, and we will get a sequence that is the same resolution, the same frame rate and length, and there is my render. And as we can see, we've got these shadows coming through nicely from our shadow catcher material. So that's looking good. Now I want to bring in my, my background image, which I've got here. Let's bring this in. Now, if we have a look at this background image, if I just select on it, it's actually slightly bigger than HD. It's 1920 by 1440. So when I drop this in underneath my footage, so it's underneath the rendered text, and if I zoom out, I can actually see this footage is slightly bigger than my canvas, which is great. It means I can actually move it around a little bit and reposition it. Now what I'm going to do is I just want to move it straight upwards so we can see a bit more of this road. So if I hold down the Shift key while I'm dragging, it will constrain it to either horizontal or vertical movements. So it'll keep it snapped on horizontally, and I can reposition this a bit more where I want it. So now I'm seeing a little more of that road. So that's looking good, and we can see these shadows falling from my text, but my text is sitting up in the air. I want it sitting on the road here. So let's click on the text and just drag it downwards. And again, if I want to, I can hold down Shift, and that will keep it moving in just a vertical direction. And I can place my text so it's sitting on the road. I can put it wherever I want. I'm going to put it in this lane here. And there's that the shadow from that sequence that's sitting nicely on the road there. And that looks pretty well lined up. Now, one thing I didn't mention before in Cinema 4D was that we were trying to match the color of our lighting to the background image. And in Cinema, we just used the default physical sky, which has got this sort of blue skylight. One thing just to be careful of, if you go to your physical sky and go to its basic tab, there's a whole bunch of sky presets that you can use. Now do just be careful, because some of these presets, let's grab this blue one down here with some clouds, some of these presets do actually create volumetric clouds in the rendering, which are indicated here by these dots. Those will actually render looking like clouds once we hit the render button. The problem with these is that they actually cast a shadow onto our floor, and that can lead to some odd shading patterns on the ground here. So if you're finding some weird shading, you might have clouds in your physical sky. The easiest way to deal with that is to go to your physical sky here, and you can just delete that cloud group out of there. It'll keep the sky setting. This one, as you can see, has got some actual clouds in the background sky, but not volumetric ones in the actual scene itself. So just be careful of that. You can get actual clouds, and they can affect the shading and the shadows of your scene. Anyway, back in After Effects here, I'm happy with the positioning of this. It looks really good. Now, in the original version, the text actually wiped on. It didn't just sit there and rotate, it actually wiped on. So I'm going to use a After Effects transition to wipe and fade this, this text on. So I'm going to select my text, go to the Effects menu, and right down towards the bottom, I've got a lot of plugins, so your Effects menu might look different to mine. If we go to Transitions, we want just a linear wipe. So a linear wipe, actually what I'll do just for a second is I'll throw this onto the background just so we can see how this works. So Effect, Linear Wipe. So this is going to work on the background just for a moment. So the wipe, as you can see, wipes the image on or off. And it's just easy to see on that background. So we're going to use this to wipe our text on and off. Okay, let's delete that. Go back to our text. So here's our wipe, and if I click and drag, there's the wipe. The only problem with this wipe is though it's wiping the text off and not on. So the text is disappearing, not appearing. So what I need to do is change the direction of this wipe to the opposite direction so that it's wiping the text on. So our wipe has a wipe angle, and if we drag this around, you can see that this wipe is going on a different angle now, and if I keep dragging it all the way around to 270, it's now wiping our text on rather than off. So all I've done is change the direction of this wipe, so that's working well. Now if I'll just scrub through this text a little further. If we look at this text, it's sort of an italic text on a bit of a lean. So what I'd quite like to do is get my wipe, the angle of that wipe kind of matching that italic. So I'm just going to zoom in for a second here. And if I drag my wipe value, here's my wipe. So here it is cutting through my text. It would be nice if it was actually on the same sort of angle. So let's click and drag on this little angle setting here, and no, it's going the wrong way. Let's go back the other way. Okay, so now that looks about the same angle as the sort of the italic slant on that text. Yeah, that's nicer. I prefer that. Now the other thing I also want to do is, rather than have this super sharp edge on this, I want to have a little bit of a blur on it. Again, this whole thing's about sort of cars and speed and movement, and things when they move are slightly blurred. So I'm going to put a little bit of a feather on this wipe here to give me this slight sort of blurry motion kind of look to it. So that's looking pretty good. Let's just zoom out there. And if I just scrub through this value here, okay, that's great. So that's revealing my text. So that's looking good. So let's keyframe this so that we can get it wiping on and get it animated. So let's go back to the start of my sequence here. And what I want to do is look for where this F just starts to turn. And it's only about frame 2 or 3. So let's go to frame 3 on our timeline. Let's click and drag this transition completion, and I'm going to drag it to, it's about 95, 94, 95, something like that, but maybe a little bit less. So I just want it so that it's just made the first bit of text disappear. So about there. So it's actually 93. So let's click the little stopwatch icon, which will set our first keyframe and turn on keyframing for this value. Now I want to go through, now it was about 2 seconds to make this animation in Cinema. So let's go to 2 seconds on our timeline and then set our linear wipe down to reveal the entire text. So if we click and drag through there, that will have set another keyframe. So now we've got this text and it's spinning and revealing. That looks pretty good. What happens if I just hit spacebar to play this? That looks pretty good. I'm quite happy with that timing. Now, if you want to adjust the timing of your wipe, select your sequence, hit U on the keyboard, and U will bring up any parameters in this layer that have keyframes on them. And here we can see the start and end keyframe for that wipe. Now, if I want to make this wipe happen quicker, I can shift that keyframe shorter. And there it is there, but that's not quite right because my text is then appearing before it started animating. So let's put that kind of back where it was. And let's just play that. Just shift that a little bit to adjust the timing. So now each of these letters, as they spin, are pretty much appearing. So that's exactly what I want. So I've actually just shifted my second keyframe down to 1 second 20 frames. So just pulled it back slightly from that 2 second mark. So that's good. Now we've got our text wiping on. Okay, the last thing I wanted to do in terms of animation was just put my car graphic. Now in the original version of this, obviously it's a bit of film footage of a car driving past. I'm just going to use a car graphic for mine, just as an example. So let's go back to my folder and grab my Mustang graphic, and let's drag and drop it on top of all our footage. Now, as you can see, this is very big. So let's grab one corner of this, and if I hold the Shift key, it'll keep the proportions of my car intact as I scale it up and down. The other way of scaling it is to go to my graphic and hit S on my keyboard, and then I can click and drag on the scale value there, and that will change the scale of this car. So let's scale this, and let's just drag it into place. And I want to get mine looking about the right size to be on the road. Maybe that's a little too big. Let's bring it down just a little bit. And yeah, we'll put it about there. Okay, so again, we need to set some keyframes for this so that it drives across the screen. So at the start of my sequence, I want my Mustang out of frame, off to the left-hand side of the shot. So I'm going to click and drag, and again, I'm going to hold the Shift key down, which is going to keep it horizontal, its movement horizontal. So let's just shift it just out of shot. Make sure we're at the start of our sequence here, and I want to keyframe the position of this car. So let's hit P for position with our layer selected. There's the position value. Let's turn on the stopwatch for that. And now if I go forward again, probably about the same timing as my wipe. Let's go to, that was 1 second 20 frames. And now I'm going to grab my Mustang, again holding down the Shift key to keep it horizontal, and I'm going to drive it off the other side of the frame. And After Effects will automatically make that second keyframe for me. So if I have a look at this and just scrub through now, there's my car driving past, and you can see the text revealing in the background. So let's just hit spacebar and see what that looks like. Now the car is actually hiding the text as it's being revealed. I actually want sort of the text reveal to trail behind the car, so I need this car animation to happen a little sooner. Now I can change the keyframes around in the car. The other thing that I can do is I can just shift that entire layer a little bit so that the car is ahead of my text. So all I've done is I've grabbed that layer and just slid it to the left a little bit. It means that the car starts just in shot, but now I've got that text appearing right behind the car as it drives through the frame. So that's a little better. I prefer that. Yep, that's much better. Now obviously if you want your car to speed up a little bit, you could shorten that keyframe there just so that it zips over a little faster. Actually, I prefer mine just where it was. And the other thing I want to do is add a bit of motion blur to this car, because things when they're moving, they look a little blurry, and that'll help to smooth out this graphic a little bit. So if I go over to my Mustang graphic, I need the motion blur icon. And the way, if you can't see that, if you've got your transparencies or your track mattes or your modes visible and not your other icons, there's a little toggle switches and modes button. I'm going to click on that. And now I can see my various switches for this layer. And I want to turn on this layer's motion blur, which is the checkbox just underneath. This is a little ball with a couple of lines behind it. If I turn that on, now we can see that our car is motion blurred. So it looks like it's driving along a little bit here. If I just hit spacebar to preview that, and there is my car driving along. Okay, now the last thing I can do if I want to is I can add a sound effect. I've actually got a car drive-by sound effect, and I can grab this and just drop it into my composition. I put it down the bottom, and now I've already tested this one. I know that it kind of works already, and if I just click and drag, I might be able to hear that. So when I click and drag, if I hold down the Command key in After Effects, when I'm clicking and dragging in my timeline here, it will actually preview audio as well. So that is my sequence pretty much done. Now, if you want to, now that these layers are all composed and all working, you can go through and do some color correction if you want to. So it might be that you decide that the saturation on that red text is a little too high, so we could select that, go to our color correction effects. We've got a hue and saturation in our color balance. I can pull the saturation down a little bit if you want to. And the other thing is, in the original footage, it was shot sort of in a sort of deserty plains, and it was quite orangey looking. So quite often you might want to sort of tint your entire composition. So to do that, the easiest way is to select the top layer in your composition. For me, it's the Mustang, and I'm going to make a new adjustment layer in my layer menu. Now, adjustment layers don't do anything on their own, but any kind of effect that you put onto an adjustment layer will change everything below it. So in this adjustment layer, I'm going to go to my effects menu and go to color correction. And one of my favorite color correction tools just to do tinting is actually called Tritone, not tint. And what I like about Tritone is that it gives you a way to map the black, white, and the mid-tone colors. So when you tint, sometimes your entire image, including your wet blacks and whites, go whatever color you're tinting. This gives you a little bit more option. So I'm going to keep the white parts of the image white and the black parts black, but the mid-tones, I'm going to make them sort of an orangey color. Now that's pretty intense, but what I can do is I can blend that tint, and if I drag this value up, I can just tint that a little so it's a little bit more sort of orangey and deserty. So we can do that if we want to, and just make that look a little bit more like the original. Now this is just a very simple way to color correct this entire composition. Up to you what sort of color correction tools you might like to use, but as I said, this is a nice one just for sort of tinting stuff. Another thing I like to do when I'm using adjustment layers is label them, because I often end up with a lot of adjustment layers. So I can select this layer, hit return on my keyboard, and I'm just going to call this orange tint. Am I spelling that right? Yes. Just so I know what that layer is doing. And if I turn that on and off, I can see the difference that it's making to my footage. So that's looking really good. I'm happy with that. I'm ready to render this. So let's save this composition, file save. Now there's two different ways of rendering this. Well, there's several different ways of rendering. I use Media Encoder to render H.264 movies. What we can do is, I've got Media Encoder open already in the background. What we can do is select this timeline here, this composition, and go to our composition menu, and we can add it to the Media Encoder queue. And if I jump back in Media Encoder, after a few seconds, this will, well, it should appear in the queue here. Sometimes Media Encoder, I find, can be a little glitchy sometimes, and it doesn't always load your projects. Okay, mine one has actually arrived here. I'm just going to delete it out of there and show you another way to add this in. So another way is to, just got to find my folder. Where have I saved this? I'll just resave this because I can't remember where I've saved this one. Save this as, let's put it in my original folder on the desktop, FH comp, there we go. So with Media Encoder, the other way that you can add files is to grab your After Effects project just from your file browser, and you can drag and drop it directly into Media Encoder. It will ask you which composition you want to render. Now in After Effects, I've only got one composition in this particular sequence. I've only got this fast one here. So when we see after a few seconds, After Effects, Media Encoder tells me, here's your project, there's the composition I want, so I can hit OK. You can also browse in Media Encoder from this media browser here and drag in your After Effects project that way. So for my settings here, what I want to do is make sure that I'm rendering an H.264 movie, which is what I want to use to output this sequence. I want to match the source. Let me click on these presets. I'm just going to do match source high bitrate. So that means match the source settings, the frame rate and resolution. High bitrate means basically a high quality render. And under the output file, I can click on this and just choose where I'm going to save this movie file. So I'm just going to put this in the original folder, give it a name, Fast Titles, and now hit the render button, which is that little play icon. And now this should be a very fast render because there's only a couple of layers in it and not many effects, so it should render very quickly. It'll just take a few seconds to connect to that After Effects project. And now we can see this is rendering through. Obviously, depending on the speed of your computer, your render will be faster or slower. I'm using quite an old laptop, so even for this basic composition, it's a little slow to render. In fact, it's very slow. Oh, there we go. Now it's taking off. And in a second, this should be finished. And if I go to my folder once that's finished, there we go. Here is my movie file. If I hit spacebar to preview, there it is there. Okay, so that's our movie made. That's our 3D MoText introduction from Cinema 4D with a little bit of After Effects compositing.